Welcome to Poland Daily History with me, Nicholas Richardson. And as we mark the 79th anniversary of the outbreak of the Warsaw Uprising, now is perhaps a particularly interesting moment to consider Russian involvement, or rather Soviet involvement, or lack of involvement at the time. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Adam Starzyński. Adam, welcome back.
Thank you.
Wouldn't be the same without you. Now, we look at the Warsaw Uprising. I think particularly it's been controversial for a long time, the lack of the Soviet involvement. But perhaps we should start by looking at Soviet-Polish relations during the war and see if we can shed some light on why the events of 1944 were as they turned out to be.
It is a very interesting topic, and if we look at the events of today, naturally have the war in Ukraine in mind here. Some people in the West were shocked when in February Vladimir Putin would repeatedly state that despite this military buildup on the borders of Ukraine, there was no chance, there was absolutely no plans at all for Russia to invade Ukraine. And then all of a sudden, a few days later, it happened after all. For the Poles, those lies were of no surprise, because we have experience of it, and the Warsaw Uprising is one of those examples of Soviet lies. If we look at Polish-Soviet relations, then naturally the war starts with the stab in the back on September 17th, 1939. That is the Soviet involvement in that sense starts as naturally the Germans invaded on September 1st, but on September 17th the Red Army invades Poland as well, starts fighting against the Polish army, and quickly starts taking the large part of what was eastern Poland of that time. Then after taking hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers as prisoners of war, they isolate the officers, and quickly in the next year, in the spring of 1940, they execute 22,000 of them in the Katyn massacre. Initially, the Poles didn't know what had happened to the officers, and the following year, in 1941, the Germans invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. This creates a new environment in which the Poles and the Soviets become allies through the Sikorski-Majski agreement. The British are naturally the ones that facilitate this happening. Soon thereafter, in December, the Americans join the war as well. And then you have the Americans and the British together trying to somehow lubricate, so to say, this very difficult relationship between the Poles and the Soviets. Despite trials and tribulations, it holds until 1943, when the Germans announced that they have discovered the graves from the Katyn massacre. And the Poles quickly realized that it is likely that it is not, as the Soviets claim, that these are Polish POWs that have been executed by Germany, but these are those Polish officers that went missing after having been taken as prisoners of war by the Soviet Union in 1939. So on April 25th, Stalin decides to completely end all relations with the Polish government in exile. After that moment, the relationship goes back to not as hostile as it was in 1939, as the Americans and the Brits are still pushing for the Poles. They are hoping that there could be some form of reconciliation. But with the Red Army advancing further and further west, in 1944, especially in the spring and early summer, with Operation Bagration, which takes the Red Army from what is today eastern Belarus. It takes it almost all the way up to Warsaw. It becomes more pressing to find a solution to the Polish-Soviet relationship. The Poles at that time, they still have some hopes that maybe some form of agreement could be reached with the Soviets. This is part of why they decide on Operation Tempest or Operation Burza, which was basically the idea that as the Soviets show up to eastern Poland, then the Poles will conduct an uprising against the Germans along the front line, so to say, just behind enemy lines, and welcome the Soviets as the allies of our allies, but also as the hosts of that territory. So it starts in Lviv and Vilnius, where the Polish underground, the Home Army, they actively aid the Soviets. They start fighting either together with the Soviets as they enter and start fighting against the Germans, or even before that, they start fighting within the cities before the Red Army shows up, when they were still on the outskirts of the cities. And initially, the cooperation is quite good during the battles for Lviv and Vilnius. It is first after that the Soviets have taken the cities that the reports start coming in that the Soviets have invited the commanders of the Polish units in those cities to talks with the Soviets, but instead they are arrested and subsequently taken far east into Russia, or in some cases that the Soviets just turn against the Polish units and starts fighting against them.
Adam, as usual, we've come to the end of the segment, so I'm going to have to ask you to pause there, but we'll pick it up next time. There we are. I've had to interrupt Adam almost in mid-sentence, but fear not, if you join us next time, as we hope you will, we'll continue the story. In the meantime, thank you for watching Poland Daily History, and we look forward to seeing you next time.